Chapter 9 The Avduhin pond, near which Natalya had fixed the place of meeting, had long ceased to be a pond. 30 years before it had burst through its banks, and it had been given up since then. Only by the smooth flat surface of the hollow, once covered with slimy mud, and the traces of the banks, could one guess that it had been a pond. A farmhouse had stood near it. It had long ago passed away. 2 huge pine trees preserved its memory. The wind was for ever droning and sullenly murmuring in their high, gaunt tree tops. There were mysterious tales among the people of a fearful crime supposed to have been committed under them. They used to tell, too, that not one of them would fall without bringing death to someone, that a third had once stood there, which had fallen in a storm and crushed a girl. The whole place near the old pond was supposed to be haunted. It was a barren wilderness, dark and gloomy, even on a sunny day. It seemed darker and gloomier still from the old, old forest of dead and withered oak trees which was near it. A few huge trees lifted their grey heads above the low undergrowth of bushes like weary giants. They were a sinister sight. It seemed as though wicked old men had met together bent on some evil design. A narrow path, almost indistinguishable, wandered beside it. No one went near the Avduhin pond without some urgent reason. Natalya intentionally chose this solitary place. It was not more than a half-mile from Darya Mikhailovna's house. The sun had already risen some time when Rudin reached the Avduhin pond, but it was not a bright morning. Thick clouds of the color of milk covered the whole sky, and were driven flying before the whistling, shrieking wind. Rudin began to walk up and down along the bank, which was covered with clinging burdocks and blackened nettles. He was not easy in his mind. These interviews, these new emotions had a charm for him, but they also troubled him, especially after the note of the night before. He felt that the end was drawing near, and was in secret perplexity of spirit, though none would have imagined it, seeing with what concentrated determination he folded his arms across his chest and looked around him. Pigasov had once said truly of him that he was like a Chinese idol. His head was constantly overbalancing him. But with the head alone, however strong it may be, it is hard for a man to know even what is passing in himself. Rudin, the clever, penetrating Rudin, was not capable of saying certainly whether he loved Natalya, whether he was suffering, and whether he would suffer at parting from her. Why then, since he had not the least disposition to play the Lovelace, one must do him that credit, had he turned the poor girl's head? Why was he awaiting her with a secret tremor? To this, the only answer is that there are none so easily carried away as those who are without passion. He walked on the bank, while Natalya was hurrying to him straight across country through the wet grass. "Natalya Alexyevna, you'll get your feet wet," said her maid Masha, scarcely able to keep up with her. Natalya did not hear and ran on without looking round. "Ah, supposing they've seen us!" cried Masha. "Indeed, it's surprising how we got out of the house, and Mamselle may wake up. It's a mercy it's not far. Ah, the gentleman's waiting already," she added, suddenly catching sight of Rudin's majestic figure, standing out picturesquely on the bank. "But what does he want to stand on that mound for? He ought to have kept in the hollow." Natalya stopped. "Wait here, Masha, by the pines," she said, and went on to the pond. Rudin went up to her. He stopped short in amazement. He had never seen such an expression on her face before. Her brows were contracted, her lips set, her eyes looked sternly straight before her. "Dmitri Nikolaitch," she began, "we have no time to lose. I have come for 5 minutes. I must tell you that my mother knows everything. Mr. Pandalevsky saw us the day before yesterday, and he told her of our meeting. He was always mamma's spy. She called me into her yesterday." "Good God!" cried Rudin. "This is terrible! What did your mother say?" "She was not angry with me. She did not scold me, but she reproached me for my want of discretion." "That was all?" "Yes, and she declared she would sooner see me dead than your wife." "Is it possible she said that?" "Yes, and she said that you yourself did not want to marry me at all, that you had only been flirting with me because you were bored, and that she had not expected this of you, but that she herself was to blame for having allowed me to see so much of you, that she relied on my good sense, that I had very much surprised her, and I don't remember now all she said to me." Natalya uttered all this in an even, almost expressionless voice. "And you, Natalya Alexyevna, what did you answer?" asked Rudin. "What did I answer?" repeated Natalya. "What do you intend to do now?" "Good God! Good God!" replied Rudin. "It is cruel! So soon, such a sudden blow! And is your mother in such indignation?" "Yes, yes, she will not hear of you." "It is terrible! You mean there is no hope?" "None." "Why should we be so unhappy? That abominable Pandalevsky! You ask me, Natalya Alexyevna, what I intend to do? My head is going round, I cannot take in anything. I can feel nothing but my unhappiness. I am amazed that you can preserve such self-possession." "Do you think it is easy for me?" said Natalya. Rudin began to walk along the bank. Natalya did not take her eyes off him. "Your mother did not question you?" he said at last. "She asked me whether I love you." "Well, and you?" Natalya was silent a moment. "I told the truth." Rudin took her hand. "Always, in all things generous, noble-hearted. Oh, the heart of a girl, it's pure gold! But did your mother really declare her decision so absolutely on the impossibility of our marriage?" "Yes, absolutely. I have told you already. She is convinced that you yourself don't think of marrying me." "Then she regards me as a traitor. What have I done to deserve it?" And Rudin clutched his head in his hands. "Dmitri Nikolaitch," said Natalya, "we are losing our time. Remember I am seeing you for the last time. I came here not to weep and lament, you see I am not crying. I came for advice." "And what advice can I give you, Natalya Alexyevna?" "What advice? You are a man. I am used to trusting to you. I shall trust you to the end. Tell me, what are your plans?" "My plans? Your mother will certainly turn me out of the house." "Perhaps. She told me yesterday that she must break off all acquaintance with you. But you do not answer my question." "What question?" "What do you think we must do now?" "What we must do?" replied Rudin. "Of course, submit." "Submit," repeated Natalya slowly, and her lips turned white. "Submit to destiny," continued Rudin. "What is to be done? I know very well how bitter it is, how painful, how unendurable. But consider yourself, Natalya Alexyevna. I am poor. It is true I could work, but even if I were a rich man, could you bear a violent separation from your family, your mother's anger? No, Natalya Alexyevna, it is useless even to think of it. It is clear it was not fated for us to live together, and the happiness of which I dreamed is not for me." All at once Natalya hid her face in her hands and began to weep. Rudin went up to her. "Natalya Alexyevna, dear Natalya," he said with warmth, "do not cry, for God's sake! Do not torture me! Be comforted!" Natalya raised her head. "You tell me to be comforted," she began, and her eyes blazed through her tears. "I am not weeping for what you suppose. I am not sad for that. I am sad because I have been deceived by you. What? I come to you for counsel and at such a moment! And your first word is, submit, submit! So this is how you translate your talk of independence, of sacrifice, which—" Her voice broke down. "But, Natalya Alexyevna," began Rudin in confusion, "remember I do not disown my words, only—" "You asked me," she continued with new force, "what I answered my mother, when she declared she would sooner agree to my death than my marriage to you. I answered that I would sooner die than marry any other man, and you say, submit. It must be that she is right. You must, through having nothing to do, through being bored, have been playing with me." "I swear to you, Natalya Alexyevna, I assure you," maintained Rudin. But she did not listen to him. "Why did you not stop me? Why did you yourself, or did you not reckon upon obstacles? I am ashamed to speak of this, but I see it is all over now." "You must be calm, Natalya Alexyevna," Rudin was beginning. "We must think together what means " "You have so often talked of self-sacrifice," she broke in. "But do you know, if you had said to me to day at once, 'I love you, but I cannot marry you. I will not answer for the future. Give me your hand and come with me,' do you know, I would have come with you. Do you know, I would have risked everything? But there's all the difference between word and deed, and you were afraid now, just as you were afraid the day before yesterday at dinner of Volintsev." The colour rushed to Rudin's face. Natalya's unexpected energy had astounded him, but her last words wounded his vanity. "You are too angry now, Natalya Alexyevna," he began. "You cannot realize how bitterly you wound me. I hope that in time you will do me justice. You will understand what it has cost me to renounce the happiness which you have said yourself would have laid upon me no obligations. Your peace is dearer to me than anything in the world, and I should have been the basest of men if I could have taken advantage." Perhaps," interrupted Natalya, "perhaps you are right. I don't know what I am saying. But up to this time I believed in you, believed in every word you said. For the future, pray keep a watch upon your words, do not fling them about at hazard. When I said to you, 'I love you,' I knew what that word meant. I was ready for everything. Now I have only to thank you for a lesson, and to say good bye." "Stop, for God's sake, Natalya Alexyevna, I beseech you. I do not deserve your contempt. I swear to you. Put yourself in my position. I am responsible for you and for myself. If I did not love you with the most devoted love, why, good God, I should have at once proposed you should run away with me. Sooner or later your mother would forgive us, and then but before thinking of my own happiness " He stopped. Natalya's eyes fastened directly upon him put him to confusion. "You try to prove to me that you are an honourable man, Dmitri Nikolaitch," she said. "I do not doubt that. You are not capable of acting from calculation. But did I want to be convinced of that? Did I come here for that?" "I did not expect, Natalya Alexyevna." "Ah, you have said it at last. Yes, you did not expect all this. You did not know me. Do not be uneasy. You do not love me, and I will never force myself on any one." "I love you!" cried Rudin. Natalya drew herself up. "Perhaps, but how do you love me? Remember all your words, Dmitri Nikolaitch. You told me, 'Without complete equality there is no love.' You are too exalted for me. I am no match for you. I am punished as I deserve. There are duties before you more worthy of you. I shall not forget this day. Good bye." "Natalya Alexyevna, are you going? Is it possible for us to part like this?" He stretched out his hand to her. She stopped. His supplicating voice seemed to make her waver. "No," she uttered at last, "I feel that something in me is broken. I came here, I have been talking to you as if it were in delirium. I must try to recollect. It must not be, you yourself said, it will not be. Good God, when I came out here, I mentally took a farewell of my home, of my past, and what? Whom have I met here? A coward! And how did you know I was not able to bear a separation from my family? Your mother will not consent. It is terrible. That was all I heard from you, that you, Rudin? No. Good bye. Ah! If you had loved me, I should have felt it now, at this moment. No, no. Good bye." She turned swiftly and ran towards Masha, who had begun to be uneasy and had been making signs to her a long while. "It is you who are afraid, not I!" cried Rudin after Natalya. She paid no attention to him, and hastened homewards across the fields. She succeeded in getting back to her bedroom, but she had scarcely crossed the threshold when her strength failed her, and she fell senseless into Masha's arms. But Rudin remained a long while still standing on the bank. At last he shivered, and with slow steps made his way to the little path and quietly walked along it. He was deeply ashamed and wounded. "What a girl!" he thought. "At 17! No, I did not know her. She is a remarkable girl. What strength of will! She is right, she deserves another love than what I felt for her." "I felt for her?" he asked himself. "Can it be I already feel no more love for her? So this is how it was all to end. What a pitiful wretch I was beside her! The slight rattle of a racing droshky made Rudin raise his head. Lezhnyov was driving to meet him with his invariable trotting pony. Rudin bowed to him without speaking, and as though struck with a sudden thought, turned out of the road and walked quickly in the direction of Darya Mikhailovna's house. Lezhnyov let him pass, looked after him, and after a moment's thought he too turned his horse's head round, and drove back to Volintsev's, where he had spent the night. He found him asleep, and giving orders he should not be waked, he sat down on the balcony to wait for some tea, and smoked a pipe. Chapter 10. Volintsev got up at 10 o'clock. When he heard that Lezhnyov was sitting in the balcony, he was much surprised, and sent to ask him to come to him. "What has happened?" he asked him. "I thought you meant to drive home." "Yes, I did mean to, but I met Rudin. He was wandering about the country with such a distracted countenance, so I turned back at once." "You came back because you met Rudin?" "That's to say, to tell the truth, I don't know why I came back myself. I suppose because I was reminded of you. I wanted to be with you, and I have plenty of time before I need go home." Volintsev smiled bitterly. "Yes, one cannot think of Rudin without thinking of me. Boy," he cried harshly, "bring us some tea." The friends began to drink tea. Lezhnyov talked of agricultural matters, of a new method of roofing barns with paper. Suddenly Volintsev leaped up from his chair and struck the table with such force that the cups and saucers rang. "No!" he cried, "I cannot bear this any longer. I will call out this witty fellow, and let him shoot me. At least I will try to put a bullet through his learned brains." "What are you talking about? Upon my word," grumbled Lezhnyov, "how can you scream like that? I dropped my pipe. What's the matter with you?" "The matter is that I can't hear his name and keep calm. It sets all my blood boiling." "Hush, my dear fellow, hush! Aren't you ashamed?" rejoined Lezhnyov, picking up his pipe from the ground. "Leave off, let him alone." "He has insulted me," pursued Volintsev, walking up and down the room. "Yes, he has insulted me. You must admit that yourself. At first I was not sharp enough, he took me by surprise. And who could have expected this? But I will show him that he cannot make a fool of me. I will shoot him, the damned philosopher, like a partridge." "Much you will gain by that, indeed. I won't speak of your sister now. I can see you're in a passion. How could you think of your sister? But in relation to another individual, what? Do you imagine, when you've killed the philosopher, you can improve your own chances?" Volintsev flung himself into a chair. "Then I must go away somewhere. For here my heart is simply being crushed by misery, only I can find no place to go." "Go away. That's another matter. That I am ready to agree to. And do you know what I should suggest? Let us go together to the Caucasus, or simply to Little Russia, to eat dumplings. That's a capital idea, my dear fellow." "Yes, but whom shall we leave my sister with?" "And why should not Alexandra Pavlovna come with us? Upon my soul, it will be splendid. As for looking after her, yes, I'll undertake that. There will be no difficulty in getting anything we want. If she likes, I will arrange a serenade under her window every night. I will sprinkle the coachman with eau de Cologne, and strew flowers along the roads. And we shall both be simply new men, my dear boy. We shall enjoy ourselves so, we shall come back so fat, that we shall be proof against the darts of love." "You are always joking, Misha." "I'm not joking at all. It was a brilliant idea of yours." "No, nonsense!" Volintsev shouted again. "I want to fight him, to fight him." "Again! What a rage you are in!" A servant entered with a letter in his hand. "From whom?" asked Lezhnyov. "From Rudin, Dmitry Nikolaitch. The Lasunsky's servant brought it." "From Rudin?" repeated Volintsev. "To whom?" "To you." "To me? Give it to me." Volintsev seized the letter, quickly tore it open, and began to read. Lezhnyov watched him attentively. A strange, almost joyful amazement was expressed on Volintsev's face. He let his hands fall by his side. "What is it?" asked Lezhnyov. "Read it," Volintsev said in a low voice, and handed him the letter. Lezhnyov began to read. This is what Rudin wrote: Sir, I am going away from Darya Mikhailovna's house today, and leaving it for ever. This will certainly be a surprise to you, especially after what passed yesterday. I cannot explain to you what exactly obliges me to act in this way, but it seems to me for some reason that I ought to let you know of my departure. You do not like me, and even regard me as a bad man. I do not intend to justify myself. Time will justify me. In my opinion, it is even undignified in a man, and quite unprofitable, to try to prove to a prejudiced man the injustice of his prejudice. Whoever wishes to understand me will not blame me, and as for anyone who does not wish, or cannot do so, his censure does not pain me. I was mistaken in you. In my eyes you remain as before, a noble and honourable man, but I imagine you were able to be superior to the surroundings in which you were brought up. I was mistaken. What of that? It is not the first, nor will it be the last time. I repeat to you, I am going away. I wish you all happiness. Confess that this wish is completely disinterested, and I hope that now you will be happy. Perhaps in time you will change your opinion of me. Whether we shall ever meet again, I don't know. But in any case, I remain your sincere well-wisher, D.R. P.S. The 200 roubles I owe you I will send directly I reach my estate in T province. Also, I beg you not to speak to Darya Mikhailovna of this letter. P.P.S. One last, but important request more. Since I am going away, I hope you will not allude before Natalya Alexyevna to my visit to you. Well, what do you say to that? Asked Volintsev, directly Lezhnyov had finished the letter. What is one to say? Replied Lezhnyov. Cry Allah, Allah, like a Mussulman, and sit gaping with astonishment, that's all one can do. Well, a good riddance. But it's curious. You see, he thought it his duty to write you this letter, and he came to see you from a sense of duty. These gentlemen find a duty at every step. Some duty they owe, or some debt, added Lezhnyov, pointing with a smile to the postscript. And what phrases he rounds off! Cried Volintsev. He was mistaken in me. He expected I would be superior to my surroundings. What a rigmarole! Good God! It's worse than poetry. Lezhnyov made no reply, but his eyes were smiling. Volintsev got up. I want to go to Darya Mikhailovna's, he announced. I want to find out what it all means. Wait a little, my dear boy. Give him time to get off. What's the good of running up against him again? He is to vanish, it seems. What more do you want? Better go and lie down and get a little sleep. You've been tossing about all night, I expect, but everything will be smooth for you. What leads you to that conclusion? Oh, I think so. There, go and have a nap. I will go and see your sister. I will keep her company. I don't want to sleep in the least. What's the object of my going to bed? I had rather go out to the fields, said Volintsev, putting on his outdoor coat. Well, that's a good thing too. Go along, and look at the fields. And Lezhnyov betook himself to the apartments of Alexandra Pavlovna. He found her in the drawing room. She welcomed him effusively. She was always pleased when he came, but her face still looked sorrowful. She was uneasy about Rudin's visit the day before. You have seen my brother? She asked Lezhnyov. How is he today? All right. He has gone to the fields. Alexandra Pavlovna did not speak for a minute. Tell me, please, she began, gazing earnestly at the hem of her pocket handkerchief. Don't you know why? Rudin came here? Put in Lezhnyov. I know. He came to say good-bye. Alexandra Pavlovna lifted up her head. What? To say good-bye? Yes. Haven't you heard? He is leaving Darya Mikhailovna's. He is leaving? Forever. At least he says so. But pray, how is one to explain it, after all? Oh, that's a different matter. To explain it is impossible, but it is so. Something must have happened with them. He pulled the string too tight, and it has snapped. Mikhailo Mikhailitch, began Alexandra Pavlovna, I don't understand. You are laughing at me, I think. No, indeed, I tell you he is going away, and he even let his friends know by letter. It's just as well, I dare say, from one point of view. But his departure has prevented one surprising enterprise from being carried out that I had begun to talk to your brother about. What do you mean? What enterprise? Why, I proposed to your brother that we should go on our travels, to distract his mind, and take you with us. To look after you especially I would take on myself.' 'That's capital!' cried Alexandra Pavlovna. 'I can fancy how you would look after me. Why, you would let me die of hunger.' 'You say so, Alexandra Pavlovna, because you don't know me. You think I am a perfect blockhead, a log, but do you know I am capable of melting like sugar, of spending whole days on my knees? I should like to see that, I must say.' Lezhnyov suddenly got up. 'Well, marry me, Alexandra Pavlovna, and you will see all that.' Alexandra Pavlovna blushed up to her ears. 'What did you say, Mihailo Mihailitch?' she murmured in confusion. 'I said what it has been for ever so long,' answered Lezhnyov, 'on the tip of my tongue to say 1,000 times over. I have brought it out at last, and you must act as you think best. But I will go away now, so as not to be in your way. If you will be my wife, I will walk away. If you don't dislike the idea, you need only send to call me in. I shall understand.' Alexandra Pavlovna tried to keep Lezhnyov, but he went quickly away, and going into the garden without his cap, he leaned on a little gate and began looking about him. 'Mihailo Mihailitch!' sounded the voice of a maidservant behind him. 'Please come in to my lady. She sent me to call you.' Mihailo Mihailitch turned round, took the girl's head in both his hands, to her great astonishment, and kissed her on the forehead. Then he went in to Alexandra Pavlovna. Chapter 11. On returning home, directly after his meeting with Lezhnyov, Rudin shut himself up in his room, and wrote 2 letters, one to Volintsev, already known to the reader, and the other to Natalya. He sat a very long time over this second letter, crossed out and altered a great deal in it, and copying it carefully on a fine sheet of note paper, folded it as small as possible, and put it in his pocket. With a look of pain on his face, he paced several times up and down his room, sat down in the chair before the window, leaning on his arm, a tear slowly appeared upon his eyelashes. He got up, buttoned himself up, called a servant and told him to ask Darya Mihailovna if he could see her. The man returned quickly, answering that Darya Mihailovna would be delighted to see him. Rudin went to her. She received him in her study, as she had that first time 2 months before. But now she was not alone. With her was sitting Pandalevsky, unassuming, fresh, neat, and agreeable as ever. Darya Mihailovna met Rudin affably, and Rudin bowed affably to her. But at the first glance at the smiling faces of both, any one of even small experience would have understood that something of an unpleasant nature had passed between them, even if it had not been expressed. Rudin knew that Darya Mihailovna was angry with him. Darya Mihailovna suspected that he was now aware of all that had happened. Pandalevsky's disclosure had greatly disturbed her. It touched on the worldly pride in her. Rudin, a poor man without rank, and so far without distinction, had presumed to make a secret appointment with her daughter, the daughter of Darya Mihailovna Lasunsky. 'Granting he is clever, he is a genius,' she said. 'What does that prove? Why, any one may hope to be my son-in-law after that?' 'For a long time I could not believe my eyes,' put in Pandalevsky. 'I am surprised at his not understanding his position.' Darya Mihailovna was very much agitated, and Natalya suffered for it. She asked Rudin to sit down. He sat down, but not like the old Rudin, almost master of the house, not even like an old friend, but like a guest, and not even a very intimate guest. All this took place in a single instant, so water is suddenly transformed into solid ice. 'I have come to you, Darya Mihailovna,' began Rudin, 'to thank you for your hospitality. I have had some news to day from my little estate, and it is absolutely necessary for me to set off there to day.' Darya Mihailovna looked attentively at Rudin. 'He has anticipated me. It must be because he has some suspicion,' she thought. 'He spares one a disagreeable explanation. So much the better. Ah, clever people for ever.' 'Really?' she replied aloud. 'Ah, how disappointing! Well, I suppose there's no help for it. I shall hope to see you this winter in Moscow. We shall soon be leaving here. I don't know, Darya Mikhailovna, whether I shall succeed in getting to Moscow, but if I can manage it, I shall regard it as a duty to call on you." "Aha, my good sir!" Pandalevsky in his turn reflected. "It's not long since you behaved like the master here, and now this is how you have to express yourself." "Then I suppose you have unsatisfactory news from your estate?" he articulated, with his customary ease. "Yes," replied Rudin dryly. "Some failure of crops, I suppose?" "No, something else. Believe me, Darya Mikhailovna," added Rudin, "I shall never forget the time I have spent in your house." "And I, Dmitri Nikolaitch, shall always look back upon our acquaintance with you with pleasure. When must you start?" "To day, after dinner." "So soon! Well, I wish you a successful journey. But if your affairs do not detain you, perhaps you will look us up again here." "I shall scarcely have time," replied Rudin, getting up. "Excuse me," he added, "I cannot at once repay you my debt, but directly I reach my place—" "Nonsense, Dmitri Nikolaitch!" Darya Mikhailovna cut him short. "I wonder you're not ashamed to speak of it. What o'clock is it?" she asked. Pandalevsky drew a gold and enamel watch out of his waistcoat pocket, and looked at it carefully, bending his rosy cheek over his stiff white collar. 33 minutes past 2, he announced. "It is time to dress," observed Darya Mikhailovna. "Good bye for the present, Dmitri Nikolaitch." Rudin got up. The whole conversation between him and Darya Mikhailovna had a special character. In the same way actors repeat their parts, and diplomatic dignitaries interchange their carefully worded phrases. Rudin went away. He knew by now through experience that men and women of the world do not even break with a man who is of no further use to them, but simply let him drop, like a kid glove after a ball, like the paper that has wrapped up sweets, like an unsuccessful ticket for a lottery. He packed quickly, and began to await with impatience the moment of his departure. Every one in the house was very much surprised to hear of his intentions. Even the servants looked at him with a puzzled air. Bassistoff did not conceal his sorrow. Natalya evidently avoided Rudin. She tried not to meet his eyes. He succeeded, however, in slipping his note into her hand. After dinner Darya Mikhailovna repeated once more that she hoped to see him before they left for Moscow. But Rudin made her no reply. Pandalevsky addressed him more frequently than any one. More than once Rudin felt a longing to fall upon him and give him a slap on his rosy blooming face. Mademoiselle Boncourt often glanced at Rudin with a peculiarly stealthy expression in her eyes. In old setter dogs one may sometimes see the same expression. "Aha!" she seemed to be saying to herself, "so you're caught." At last 6 o'clock struck, and Rudin's carriage was brought to the door. He began to take a hurried farewell of all. He had a feeling of nausea at his heart. He had not expected to leave this house like this. It seemed as though they were turning him out. What a way to do it all, and what was the object of being in such a hurry? Still, it is better so. That was what he was thinking as he bowed in all directions with a forced smile. For the last time he looked at Natalya, and his heart throbbed. Her eyes were bent upon him in sad reproachful farewell. He ran quickly down the steps, and jumped into his carriage. Bassistoff had offered to accompany him to the next station, and he took his seat beside him. "Do you remember," began Rudin, directly the carriage had driven from the courtyard into the broad road bordered with fir trees, "do you remember what Don Quixote says to his squire when he is leaving the court of the Duchess? 'Freedom,' he says, 'my friend Sancho, is one of the most precious possessions of man, and happy is he to whom heaven has given a bit of bread, and who need not be indebted to any one.' What Don Quixote felt then, I feel now. God grant, my dear Bassistoff, that you too may some day experience this feeling." Bassistoff pressed Rudin's hand, and the honest boy's heart beat violently with emotion. Till they reached the station, Rudin spoke of the dignity of man, of the meaning of true independence. He spoke nobly, fervently, and justly, and when the moment of separation had come, Bassistoff could not refrain from throwing himself on his neck and sobbing. Rudin himself shed tears too, but he was not weeping because he was parting from Bassistoff. His tears were the tears of wounded vanity. Natalya had gone to her own room, and there she read Rudin's letter. Dear Natalya Alexyevna, he wrote her, I have decided to depart. There is no other course open to me. I have decided to leave before I am told plainly to go. By my departure all difficulties will be put an end to, and there will be scarcely any one who will regret me. What else did I expect? It is always so. But why am I writing to you? I am parting from you probably forever, and it would be too painful to me to leave you with a worse recollection of me than I deserve. This is why I am writing to you. I do not want either to justify myself or to blame anyone whatever except myself. I want, as far as possible, to explain myself. The events of the last days have been so unexpected, so sudden. Our interview today will be a memorable lesson to me. Yes, you are right. I did not know you, and I thought I knew you. In the course of my life I have had to do with people of all kinds. I have known many women and young girls, but in you I met for the first time an absolutely true and upright soul. This was something I was not used to, and I did not know how to appreciate you fittingly. I felt an attraction to you from the first day of our acquaintance. You may have observed it. I spent with you hour after hour without learning to know you. I scarcely even tried to know you, and I could imagine that I loved you. For this sin I am punished now. Once before I loved a woman, and she loved me. My feeling for her was complex, like hers for me. But as she was not simple herself, it was all the better for her. Truth was not told to me then, and now I did not recognize it when it was offered me. I have recognized it at last, when it is too late. What is past cannot be recalled. Our lives might have become united, and they never will be united now. How can I prove to you that I might have loved you with real love, the love of the heart, not of the fancy, when I do not know myself whether I am capable of such love? Nature has given me much. I know it, and I will not disguise it from you through false modesty, especially now, at a moment so bitter, so humiliating for me. Yes, nature has given me much, but I shall die without doing anything worthy of my powers, without leaving any trace behind me. All my wealth is dissipated idly. I do not see the fruits of the seeds I sow. I am wanting in something. I cannot say myself exactly what it is I am wanting in. I am wanting, certainly, in something without which one cannot move men's hearts, or wholly win a woman's heart. And to sway men's minds alone is precarious, and an empire ever unprofitable. A strange, almost farcical fate is mine. I would devote myself eagerly and wholly to some cause, and I cannot devote myself. I shall end by sacrificing myself in some folly or other, in which I shall not even believe. Alas, at 35 to be still preparing for something! I have never spoken so openly of myself to anyone before. This is my confession. But enough of me. I should like to speak of you, to give you some advice. I can be no use to you further. You are still young, but as long as you live, always follow the impulse of your heart. Do not let it be subordinated to your mind or the mind of others. Believe me, the simpler, the narrower the circle in which life is passed, the better. The great thing is not to open out new sides, but that all the phases of life should reach perfection in their own time. Blessed is he who has been young in his youth. But I see that this advice applies far more to myself than to you. I confess, Natalya Alexyevna, I am very unhappy. I never deceived myself as to the nature of the feeling which I inspired in Darya Mikhailovna, but I hoped I had found at least a temporary home. Now I must take the chances of the rough world again. What will replace for me your conversation, your presence, your attentive and intelligent face? I myself am to blame, but admit that fate seems to have designed a jest at my expense. A week ago I did not even myself suspect that I loved you. The day before yesterday, that evening in the garden, I for the first time heard from your lips, but why remind you of what you said then? And now I am going away to day. I am going away disgraced, after a cruel explanation with you, carrying with me no hope, and you do not know yet to what a degree I am to blame as regards you. I have such a foolish lack of reserve, such a weak habit of confiding. But why speak of this? I am leaving you forever. Here Rudin had related to Natalya his visit to Volintsev, but on second thoughts he erased all that part, and added the second postscript to his letter to Volintsev. I remain alone upon earth to devote myself, as you said to me this morning with bitter irony, to other interests more congenial to me. Alas, if I could really devote myself to these interests, if I could at last conquer my inertia! But no, I shall remain to the end the incomplete creature I have always been, the first obstacle, and I collapse entirely. What has passed with you has shown me that if I had but sacrificed my love to my future work, to my vocation. But I simply was afraid of the responsibility that had fallen upon me, and therefore I am, truly, unworthy of you. I do not deserve that you should be torn out of your sphere for me. And indeed all this, perhaps, is for the best. I shall perhaps be the stronger and the purer for this experience. I wish you all happiness. Farewell. Think sometimes of me. I hope that you may still hear of me. Rudin. Natalya let Rudin's letter drop onto her lap, and sat a long time motionless, her eyes fixed on the ground. This letter proved to her clearer than all possible arguments that she had been right, when in the morning, at her parting with Rudin, she had involuntarily cried out that he did not love her. But that made things no easier for her. She sat perfectly still. It seemed as though waves of darkness, without a ray of light, had closed over her head, and she had gone down cold and dumb to the depths. The first disillusionment is painful for everyone, but for a sincere heart, averse to self-deception, and innocent of frivolity or exaggeration, it is almost unendurable. Natalya remembered her childhood, how, when walking in the evening, she always tried to go in the direction of the setting sun, where there was light in the sky, and not toward the darkened half of the heavens. Life now stood in darkness before her, and she had turned her back on the light for ever. Tears started into Natalya's eyes. Tears do not always bring relief. They are comforting and salutary when, after being long pent up in the breast, they flow at first with violence, and then more easily, more softly. The dumb agony of sorrow is over with the tears. But there are cold tears, tears that flow sparingly, wrung out drop by drop from the heart by the immovable, weary weight of pain laid upon it. They are not comforting, and bring no relief. Poverty weeps such tears, and the man had not yet been unhappy who has not shed them. Natalya knew them on that day. 2 hours passed. Natalya pulled herself together, got up, wiped her eyes, and, lighting a candle, she burnt Rudin's letter in the flame, and threw the ash out the window. Then she opened Pushkin at random, and read the first lines that met her. She often made it her oracle in this way. This is what she saw. When he has known its pang, for him the torturing ghost of days that are no more, for him no more illusion but remorse, and memory's serpent gnawing at his heart. She stopped, and with a cold smile looked at herself in the glass, slightly nodded her head, and went down to the drawing-room. Darya Mihailovna, directly she saw her, called her into her study, made her sit near her, and caressingly stroked her cheek. Meanwhile she gazed attentively, almost with curiosity, into her eyes. Darya Mihailovna was secretly perplexed. For the first time it struck her that she did not really understand her daughter. When she had heard from Pandalevsky of her meeting with Rudin, she was not so much displeased as amazed that her sensible Natalya could resolve upon such a step. But when she had sent for her, and fell to upbraiding her, not at all as one would have expected from a lady of European renown, but with loud and vulgar abuse, Natalya's firm replies, and the resolution of her looks and movements, had confused and even intimidated her. Rudin's sudden and wholly unexplained departure had taken a great load off her heart, but she had expected tears and hysterics. Natalya's outward composure threw her out of her reckoning again. "Well, child," began Darya Mihailovna, "how are you to-day?" Natalya looked at her mother. "He is gone, you see, your hero. Do you know why he decided on going so quickly?" "Mamma," said Natalya in a low voice, "I give you my word, if you will not mention him, you shall never hear his name from me." "Then you acknowledge how wrongly you behaved to me?" Natalya looked down and repeated, "You shall never hear his name from me." "Well, well," answered Darya Mihailovna with a smile, "I believe you. But the day before yesterday, do you remember how... There, we will pass that over. It is all over and buried and forgotten, isn't it? Come, I know you again now, but I was altogether puzzled then. There, kiss me like a sensible girl." Natalya lifted Darya Mihailovna's hand to her lips, and Darya Mihailovna kissed her stooping head. "Always listen to my advice. Do not forget that you are a Lasunsky and my daughter," she added, "and you will be happy. And now you may go." Natalya went away in silence. Darya Mihailovna looked after her and thought, "She is like me. She too will let herself be carried away by her feelings. Mais elle a moins d'abandon." And Darya Mihailovna fell to musing over memories of the past, of the distant past. Then she summoned Mademoiselle Boncourt and remained a long time closeted with her. When she had dismissed her she sent for Pandalevsky. She wanted at all hazards to discover the real cause of Rudin's departure, but Pandalevsky succeeded in completely satisfying her. It was what he was there for. The next day Volintsev and his sister came to dinner. Darya Mihailovna was always very affable to him, but this time she was especially cordial to him. Natalya felt unbearably miserable. But Volintsev was so respectful and addressed her so timidly that she could not but be grateful to him in her heart. The day passed quietly, rather tediously, but all felt as they separated that they had fallen back into the old order of things, and that means much, very much. Yes, all had fallen back into their old order, all except Natalya. When at last she was able to be alone, she dragged herself with difficulty into her bed, and, weary and worn out, fell with her face on the pillow. Life seemed so cruel, so hateful, and so sordid. She was so ashamed of herself, her love, and her sorrow, that at that moment she would have been glad to die. There were many sorrowful days in store for her, and sleepless nights, and torturing emotions, but she was young, life had scarcely begun for her, and sooner or later life asserts its claims. Whatever blow has fallen on a man, he must, forgive the coarseness of the expression, eat that day or at least the next, and that is the first step to consolation. Natalya suffered terribly. She suffered for the first time. But the first sorrow, like first love, does not come again. And thank God for it. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. About 2 years had passed. The first days of May had come. Alexandra Pavlovna, no longer Lipin, but Lezhnyov, was sitting on the balcony of her house. She had been married to Mikhailo Mihailitch for more than a year. She was as charming as ever, and had only grown a little stouter of late. In front of the balcony, from which there were steps leading into the garden, a nurse was walking about carrying a rosy-cheeked baby in her arms, in a white cloak with a white cap on his head. Alexandra Pavlovna kept her eyes constantly on him. The baby did not cry, but sucked his thumb gravely and looked about him. He was already showing himself a worthy son of Mikhailo Mihailitch. On the balcony, near Alexandra Pavlovna, was sitting our old friend, Pigasov. He had grown noticeably grayer since we parted from him, and was bent and thin, and he lisped when he spoke. One of his front teeth had gone, and this lisp gave still greater asperity to his words. His spitefulness had not decreased with years, but his sallies were less lively, and he more frequently repeated himself. Mikhailo Mihailitch was not at home. They were expecting him to tea. The sun had already set. Where it had gone down, a streak of pale gold and lemon color stretched across the distant horizon. On the opposite quarter of the sky was a stretch of dove color below, and crimson lilac above. Light clouds seemed melting away overhead. There was every promise of prolonged fine weather. Suddenly Pigasov burst out laughing. "What is it, African Semenitch?" inquired Alexandra Pavlovna. "Oh, yesterday I heard a peasant say to his wife, she had been chattering away, 'Don't squeak!' I liked that immensely. And after all, what can a woman talk about? I never, you know, speak of present company. Our ancestors were wiser than we. The beauty in their stories always sits at the window, with a star on her brow, and never utters a syllable. That's how it ought to be. Think of it! The day before yesterday, our marshal's wife, she might have sent a pistol shot into my head, says to me she doesn't like my tendencies. Tendencies! Come, wouldn't it be better for her and for everyone if by some beneficent ordinance of nature she were suddenly deprived of the use of her tongue? Oh, you are always like that, African Semenitch. You are always attacking us poor. Do you know, it's a misfortune of a sort really. I am sorry for you." "A misfortune? Why do you say that? To begin with, in my opinion there are only 3 misfortunes: to live in winter in cold lodgings, in summer to wear tight shoes, and to spend the night in a room where a baby cries whom you can't get rid of with Persian powder. And secondly, I am now the most peaceable of men. Why, I'm a model. You know how properly I behave." "Fine behavior indeed. Only yesterday Elena Antonovna complained to me of you." "Well, and what did she tell you, if I may know?" "She told me that for one whole morning you would make no reply to all her questions but 'What?' and always in the same squeaking voice." Pigasov laughed. "But that was a happy idea, you'll allow, Alexandra Pavlovna, eh?" "Admirable indeed. Can you really have behaved so rudely to a lady, African Semenitch?" "What? Do you regard Elena Antonovna as a lady?" "What do you regard her as?" "A drum! Upon my word, an ordinary drum, such as they beat with sticks." "Oh," interrupted Alexandra Pavlovna, anxious to change the conversation, "they tell me one may congratulate you." "Upon what?" "The end of your lawsuit. The Glinovsky meadows are yours." "Yes, they are mine," replied Pigasov gloomily. "You have been trying to gain this so many years, and now you seem discontented." "I assure you, Alexandra Pavlovna," said Pigasov slowly, "nothing can be worse and more injurious than good fortune that comes too late. It cannot give you pleasure in any way, and it deprives you of the right, the precious right, of complaining and cursing Providence. Yes, madam, it's a cruel and insulting trick, belated fortune." Alexandra Pavlovna only shrugged her shoulders. "Nurse," she began, "I think it's time to put Misha to bed. Give him to me." While Alexandra Pavlovna busied herself with her son, Pigasov walked off muttering to the other corner of the balcony. Suddenly, not far off on the road that ran the length of the garden, Mihailo Mihailitch made his appearance, driving his racing droshky. 2 huge house dogs ran before the horse, one yellow, the other grey, both only lately obtained. They incessantly quarrelled, and were inseparable companions. An old pug dog came out of the gate to meet them. He opened his mouth as if he were going to bark, but ended by yawning and turning back again with a friendly wag of the tail. "Look here, Sasha!" cried Lezhnyov from the distance to his wife, "whom I am bringing you." Alexandra Pavlovna did not at once recognize the man who was sitting behind her husband's back. "Ah, Mr. Bassistoff!" she cried at last. "It's he," answered Lezhnyov, "and he has brought such glorious news. Wait a minute, you shall know directly." And he drove into the courtyard. Some minutes later he came with Bassistoff into the balcony. "Hurrah!" he cried, embracing his wife. "Serezha is going to be married." "To whom?" asked Alexandra Pavlovna, much agitated. "To Natalya, of course. Our friend has brought the news from Moscow, and there is a letter for you. Do you hear, Misha?" he went on, snatching his son into his arms. "Your uncle's going to be married? What criminal indifference! He only blinks his eyes." "He is sleepy," remarked the nurse. "Yes," said Bassistoff, going up to Alexandra Pavlovna. "I have come to day from Moscow on business for Darya Mihailovna, to go over the accounts on the estate, and here is the letter." Alexandra Pavlovna opened her brother's letter in haste. It consisted of a few lines only. In the first transport of joy he informed his sister that he had made Natalya an offer, and received her consent, and Darya Mikhailovna's, and he promised to write more by the next post, and sent embraces and kisses to all. It was clear he was writing in a state of delirium. Tea was served. Bassistoff sat down. Questions were showered upon him. Every one, even Pigasov, was delighted at the news he had brought. "Tell me, please," said Lezhnyov among the rest. "Rumours reached us of a certain Mr. Korchagin. That was all nonsense, I suppose?" Korchagin was a handsome young man, a society lion, excessively conceited and important. He behaved with extraordinary dignity, just as if he had not been a living man, but his own statue, set up by public subscription. "Well, no, not altogether nonsense," replied Bassistoff with a smile. "Darya Mikhailovna was very favourable to him. But Natalya Alexyevna would not even hear of him." "I know him," put in Pigasov. "He's a double dummy, a noisy dummy, if you like. If all people were like that, it would need a large sum of money to induce one to consent to live. Upon my word!" "Very likely," answered Bassistoff, "but he plays a leading part in society." "Well, never mind him!" cried Alexandra Pavlovna. "Peace be with him! Ah, how glad I am for my brother, I, and Natalya. Is she bright and happy?" "Yes, she is quiet, as she always is. You know her. But she seems contented." The evening was spent in friendly and lively talk. They sat down to supper. "Oh, by the way," inquired Lezhnyov of Bassistoff, as he poured him out some Lafitte, "do you know where Rudin is?" "I don't know for certain. He came last winter to Moscow for a short time, and then went with a family to Simbirsk. I corresponded with him for some time. In his last letter he informed me he was leaving Simbirsk. He did not say where he was going, and since then I have heard nothing of him." "He is all right," put in Pigasov. "He is staying somewhere sermonizing. That gentleman will always find 2 or 3 adherents everywhere, to listen to him open-mouthed and lend him money. You will see he will end by dying in some out-of-the-way corner in the arms of an old maid in a wig, who will believe he is the greatest genius in the world." "You speak very harshly of him," remarked Bassistoff in a displeased undertone. "Not a bit harshly," replied Pigasov, "but perfectly fairly. In my opinion he is simply nothing else than a sponge. I forgot to tell you," he continued, turning to Lezhnyov, "that I have made the acquaintance of that Terlahov, with whom Rudin travelled abroad. Yes, yes, what he told me of him, you cannot imagine. It's simply screaming. It's a remarkable fact that all Rudin's friends and admirers become in time his enemies." "I beg you to accept me from the number of such friends," interposed Bassistoff warmly. "Oh, you, that's a different thing. I was not speaking of you." "But what did Terlahov tell you?" asked Alexandra Pavlovna. "Oh, he told me a great deal. There's no remembering it all. But the best of all was an anecdote of what happened to Rudin. As he was incessantly developing these gentlemen always are developing. Other people simply sleep and eat, but they manage their sleeping and eating in the intervals of development. Isn't that it, Mr. Bassistoff?" Bassistoff made no reply. "And so, as he was continually developing, Rudin arrived at the conclusion, by means of philosophy, that he ought to fall in love. He began to look about for a sweetheart worthy of such an astonishing conclusion. Fortune smiled upon him. He made the acquaintance of a very pretty French dressmaker. The whole incident occurred in a German town on the Rhine, observe. He began to go and see her, to take her various books, to talk to her of Nature and Hegel. Can you fancy the position of the dressmaker? She took him for an astronomer. However, you know he's not a bad-looking fellow, and a foreigner, a Russian, of course. He took her fancy. Well, at last he invited her to a rendezvous, and a very poetical rendezvous, in a boat on the river. The Frenchwoman agreed, dressed herself in her best and went out with him in a boat. So they spent 2 hours. How do you think he was occupied all that time? He patted the Frenchwoman on the head, gazed thoughtfully at the sky, and frequently repeated that he felt for her the tenderness of a father. The Frenchwoman went back home in a fury, and she herself told the story to Terlahov afterwards. That's the kind of fellow he is." And Pigasov broke out into a loud laugh. "You old cynic," said Alexandra Pavlovna in a tone of annoyance, "but I am more and more convinced that even those who attack Rudin cannot find any harm to say of him." "No harm? Upon my word! And his perpetual living at other people's expense, his borrowing money. Mihailo Mihailitch, he borrowed of you too, no doubt, didn't he?" "Listen, African Semenitch," began Lezhnyov, and his face assumed a serious expression. "Listen. You know, and my wife knows, that the last time I saw him I felt no special attachment for Rudin, and I even often blamed him. For all that," Lezhnyov filled up the glasses with champagne, "this is what I suggest to you now. We have just drunk to the health of my dear brother and his future bride. I propose that you drink now to the health of Dmitry Rudin." Alexandra Pavlovna and Pigasov looked in astonishment at Lezhnyov, but Bassistoff sat wide-eyed, blushing and trembling all over with delight. "I know him well," continued Lezhnyov. "I am well aware of his faults. They are the more conspicuous because he himself is not on a small scale." "Rudin has character, genius!" cried Bassistoff. "Genius, very likely he has," replied Lezhnyov, "but as for character, that's just his misfortune, that there's no character in him. But that's not the point. I want to speak of what is good, of what is rare in him. He has enthusiasm, and believe me, who am a phlegmatic person enough, that is the most precious quality in our times. We have all become insufferably reasonable, indifferent, and slothful. We are asleep and cold, and thanks to anyone who will wake us up and warm us. It is high time. Do you remember, Sasha, once when I was talking to you about him, I blamed him for coldness? I was right, and wrong too, then. The coldness is in his blood, that is not his fault, and not in his head. He is not an actor, as I called him, nor a cheat, nor a scoundrel. He lives at other people's expense, not like a swindler, but like a child. Yes, no doubt he will die somewhere in poverty and want. But are we to throw stones at him for that? He never does anything himself precisely, he has no vital force, no blood, but who has the right to say that he has not been of use, that his words have not scattered good seeds in young hearts, to whom nature has not denied, as she has to him, powers for action, and the faculty of carrying out their own ideas? Indeed, I myself, to begin with, have gained all that from him. Sasha knows what Rudin did for me in my youth. I also maintained, I recollect, that Rudin's words could not produce an effect on men. But I was speaking then of men like myself, at my present age, of men who have already lived and been broken in by life. One false note in a man's eloquence, and the whole harmony is spoiled for us. But a young man's ear, happily, is not so overfine, not so trained. If the substance of what he hears seems fine to him, what does he care about the intonation? The intonation he will supply for himself. "Bravo, bravo!" cried Bassistoff. "That is justly spoken. And as regards Rudin's influence, I swear to you, that man not only knows how to move you, he lifts you up, he does not let you stand still, he stirs you to the depths, and sets you on fire." "You hear?" continued Lezhnyov, turning to Pigasov. "What further proof do you want? You attack philosophy. Speaking of it, you cannot find words contemptuous enough. I myself am not excessively devoted to it, and I know little enough about it, but our principal misfortunes do not come from philosophy. The Russian will never be infected with philosophical hair-splittings and nonsense. He has too much common sense for that. But we must not let every sincere effort after truth and knowledge be attacked under the name of philosophy. Rudin's misfortune is that he does not understand Russia, and that, certainly, is a great misfortune. Russia can do without every one of us, but not one of us can do without her. Woe to him who thinks he can, and woe twofold to him who actually does do without her. Cosmopolitanism is all twaddle. The cosmopolitan is a nonentity, worse than a nonentity. Without nationality is no art, nor truth, nor life, nor anything. You cannot even have an ideal face without individual expression. Only a vulgar face can be devoid of it. But I say again, that is not Rudin's fault, it is his fate, a cruel and unhappy fate, for which we cannot blame him." It would take us too far if we tried to trace why Rudins spring up among us. But for what is fine in him, let us be grateful to him. That is pleasanter than being unfair to him, and we have been unfair to him. It's not our business to punish him, and it's not needed. He has punished himself far more cruelly than he deserves. And God grant that unhappiness may have blotted out all the harm there was in him, and left only what was fine. I drink to the health of Rudin. I drink to the comrade of my best years. I drink to youth, to its hopes, its endeavors, its faith, and its honesty, to all that our hearts beat for at 20. We have known, and we shall know, nothing better than that in life. I drink to that golden time. To the health of Rudin!' All clinked glasses with Lezhnyov. Bassistoff, in his enthusiasm, almost cracked his glass and drained it off at a draught. Alexandra Pavlovna pressed Lezhnyov's hand. 'Why, Mikhailo Mihailitch, I did not suspect you were an orator,' remarked Pigasov. 'It was equal to Mr. Rudin himself. Even I was moved by it.' 'I am not at all an orator,' replied Lezhnyov, not without annoyance. 'But to move you, I fancy, would be difficult. But enough of Rudin. Let us talk of something else. What's his name? Pandalevsky? Is he still living at Darya Mikhailovna's?' he concluded, turning to Bassistoff. 'Oh, yes, he is still there. She has managed to get him a very profitable place.' Lezhnyov smiled. 'That's a man who won't die in want, one can count upon that.' Supper was over. The guests dispersed. When she was left alone with her husband, Alexandra Pavlovna looked smiling into his face. 'How splendid you were this evening, Misha,' she said, stroking his forehead. 'How cleverly and nobly you spoke. But confess, you exaggerated a little in Rudin's praise, as in old days you did in attacking him.' 'I can't let them hit a man when he's down. And in those days I was afraid he was turning your head.' 'No,' replied Alexandra Pavlovna naively. 'He always seemed too learned for me. I was afraid of him, and never knew what to say in his presence. But wasn't Pigasov nasty in his ridicule of him today?' 'Pigasov?' responded Lezhnyov. 'That is just why I stood up for Rudin so warmly, because Pigasov was here. He dare to call Rudin a sponge, indeed! Why, I consider the part he plays, Pigasov I mean, is 100 times worse. He has an independent property, and he sneers at every one, and yet see how he fawns upon wealthy or distinguished people. Do you know that that fellow, who abuses everything and every one with such scorn, and attacks philosophy and women, do you know that when he was in the service he took bribes and that sort of thing? Ugh! That's what he is.' 'Is it possible?' cried Alexandra Pavlovna. 'I should never have expected that. Misha,' she added after a short pause, 'I want to ask you.' 'What?' 'What do you think? Will my brother be happy with Natalya?' 'How can I tell you? There's every likelihood of it. She will take the lead. There's no reason to hide the fact between us. She is cleverer than he is. But he's a capital fellow, and loves her with all his soul. What more would you have? You see we love one another and are happy, aren't we?' Alexandra Pavlovna smiled and pressed his hand. On the same day on which all that has been described took place in Alexandra Pavlovna's house, in one of the remote districts of Russia, a wretched little covered cart, drawn by 3 village horses, was crawling along the high road in the sultry heat. On the front seat was perched a grizzled peasant in a ragged cloak, with his legs hanging slanting on the shaft. He kept flicking with the reins, which were of cord, and shaking the whip. Inside the cart there was sitting on a shaky portmanteau a tall man in a cap and old dusty cloak. It was Rudin. He sat with bent head, the peak of his cap pulled over his eyes. The jolting of the cart threw him from side to side, but he seemed utterly unconscious, as though he were asleep. At last he drew himself up. 'When are we coming to a station?' he inquired of the peasant sitting in front. 'Just over the hill, little father,' said the peasant, with a still more violent shaking of the reins. 'There's a mile and a half farther to go, not more. Come! There, look about you. I'll teach you,' he added in a shrill voice, setting to work to whip the right-hand horse. 'You seem to drive very badly,' observed Rudin. 'We have been crawling along since early morning, and we have not succeeded in getting there yet. You should have sung something.
"Well, what would you have, little father? The horses, you see yourself, are overdone, and then the heat. And I can't sing. I'm not a coachman. Hullo, you little sheep!" cried the peasant, suddenly turning to a man coming along in a brown smock, and bark shoes downtrodden at heel. "Get out of the way!" "You're a nice driver," muttered the man after him, and stood still. "You wretched Muscovite," he added in a voice full of contempt, shook his head and limped away. "What are you up to?" sang out the peasant at intervals, pulling at the shaft horse. "Ach, you devil, get on!" The jaded horses dragged themselves at last up to the posting station. Rudin crept out of the cart, paid the peasant, who did not bow to him, and kept shaking the coins in the palm of his hand a long while, evidently there was too little drink money, and himself carried the portmanteau into the posting station. A friend of mine, who has wandered a great deal about Russia in his time, made the observation that if the pictures hanging on the walls of a posting station represent scenes from The Prisoner of the Caucasus, or Russian generals, you may get horses soon, but if the pictures depict the life of the well-known gambler, Georges de Germany, the traveller need not hope to get off quickly. He will have time to admire to the full the hair à la cockatoo, the white open waistcoat, and the exceedingly short and narrow trousers of the gambler in his youth, and his exasperated physiognomy, when in his old age he kills his son, waving a chair above him, in a cottage with a narrow staircase. In the room into which Rudin walked precisely these pictures were hanging out of 30 Years, or The Life of a Gambler. In response to his call the superintendent appeared, who had just waked up. By the way, did anyone ever see a superintendent who had not just been asleep? And without even waiting for Rudin's question, informed him in a sleepy voice that there were no horses. "How can you say there are no horses," said Rudin, "when you don't even know where I am going? I came here with village horses." "We have no horses for anywhere," answered the superintendent. "But where are you going?" "To Sk—" "We have no horses," repeated the superintendent, and he went away. Rudin, vexed, went up to the window and threw his cap on the table. He was not much changed, but had grown rather yellow in the last 2 years. Silver threads shone here and there in his curls, and his eyes, still magnificent, seemed somehow dimmed. Fine lines, the traces of bitter and disquieting emotions, lay about his lips and on his temples. His clothes were shabby and old, and he had no linen visible anywhere. His best days were clearly over. As the gardeners say, he had gone to seed. He began reading the inscriptions on the walls, the ordinary distraction of weary travellers. Suddenly the door creaked and the superintendent came in. "There are no horses for Sk, and there won't be any for a long time," he said, "but here are some ready to go to V." "To V?" said Rudin. "Why, that's not on my road at all. I am going to Penza, and V lies, I think, in the direction of Tambov." "What of that? You can get there from Tambov, and from V you won't be at all out of your road." Rudin thought a moment. "Well, all right," he said at last. "Tell them to put the horses to. It is the same to me. I will go to Tambov." The horses were soon ready. Rudin carried his own portmanteau, climbed into the cart, and took his seat, his head hanging as before. There was something helpless and pathetically submissive in his bent figure, and the 3 horses went off at a slow trot. Some years had passed by. It was a cold autumn day. A travelling carriage drew up at the steps of the principal hotel of the government town of C. A gentleman, yawning and stretching, stepped out of it. He was not elderly, but had had time to acquire that fullness of figure which habitually commands respect. He went up the staircase to the 2nd story, and stopped at the entrance to a wide corridor. Seeing no one before him, he called out in a loud voice, asking for a room. A door creaked somewhere, and a long waiter jumped up from behind a low screen, and came forward with a quick flank movement, an apparition of a glossy back and tucked up sleeves in the half dark corridor. The traveller went into the room, and at once throwing off his cloak and scarf, sat down on the sofa, and with his fists propped on his knees, he first looked round as though he were hardly awake yet,
and then gave the order to send up his servant. The hotel waiter made a bow and disappeared. The traveler was no other than Lezhnyov. He had come from the country to see about some conscription business. Lezhnyov's servant, a curly-headed, rosy-cheeked youth in a grey cloak, with a blue sash round the waist and soft felt shoes, came into the room. "Well, my boy, here we are," Lezhnyov said, "and you were afraid all the while that a wheel would come off." "We are here," replied the boy, trying to smile above the high collar of his cloak, "but the reason why the wheel did not come off—" "Is there no one in here?" sounded a voice in the corridor. Lezhnyov started and listened. "Eh? Who's there?" repeated the voice. Lezhnyov got up, walked to the door, and quickly threw it open. Before him stood a tall man, bent and almost completely grey, in an old frieze coat with bronze buttons. "Rudin!" he cried in an excited voice. Rudin turned round. He could not distinguish Lezhnyov's features, as he stood with his back to the light, and he looked at him in bewilderment. "You don't know me?" said Lezhnyov. "Mikhailo Mikhailitch!" cried Rudin, and held out his hand, but drew it back again in confusion. Lezhnyov made haste to snatch it in both of his. "Come in," he said to Rudin, and drew him into the room. "How you have changed!" exclaimed Lezhnyov after a brief silence, involuntarily dropping his voice. "Yes, they say so," replied Rudin, his eyes straying about the room. "The years, and you not much. How is Alexandra, your wife?" "She is very well, thank you. But what fate brought you here?" "It is too long a story. Strictly speaking, I came here by chance. I was looking for a friend. But I am very glad. Where are you going to dine?" "Oh, I don't know. At some restaurant. I must go away from here to day." "You must?" Rudin smiled significantly. "Yes, I must. They are sending me off to my own place, to my home." "Dine with me." Rudin for the first time looked at Lezhnyov straight in the face. "You invite me to dine with you?" he said. "Yes, Rudin, for the sake of old times and old comradeship. Will you? I did not expect to meet you, and God only knows when we shall see each other again. I cannot part from you like this." "Very well, I agree." Lezhnyov pressed Rudin's hand and called his servant, ordered dinner, and told him to have a bottle of champagne put on ice. In the course of dinner, Lezhnyov and Rudin, as though by agreement, kept talking of their student days, recalling many things and many friends, dead and living. At first Rudin spoke with little interest, but when he had drunk a few glasses of wine his blood grew warmer. At last the waiter took away the last dish. Lezhnyov got up, closed the door, and coming back to the table, sat down facing Rudin, and quietly rested his chin on his hands. "Now then," he began, "tell me all that has happened to you since I saw you last." Rudin looked at Lezhnyov. "Good God," thought Lezhnyov, "how he has changed, poor fellow!" Rudin's features had undergone little change since we last saw him at the posting station, though approaching old age had had time to set its mark upon them. But their expression had become different. His eyes had a changed look. His whole being, his movements, which were at one time slow, at another abrupt and disconnected, his crushed, benumbed manner of speaking, all showed an utter exhaustion, a quiet and secret dejection, very different from the half-assumed melancholy which he had affected once, as it is generally affected by youth, when full of hopes and confident vanity. "Tell you all that has happened to me?" he said. "I could not tell you all, and it is not worth while. I am worn out. I have wandered far, in spirit as well as in flesh. What friends I have made, good God! How many things, how many men I have lost faith in! Yes, how many!" repeated Rudin, noticing that Lezhnyov was looking in his face with a kind of special sympathy. "How many times have my own words grown hateful to me! I don't mean now on my own lips, but on the lips of those who had adopted my opinions. How many times have I passed from the petulance of a child to the dull insensibility of a horse who does not lash his tail when the whip cuts him! How many times have I been happy and hopeful, and have made enemies, and humbled myself for nothing! How many times I have taken flight like an eagle, and returned crawling like a snail whose shell has been crushed. Where have I not been? What roads have I not traveled? And the roads are often dirty," added Rudin, slightly turning away. "You know," he was continuing. "Listen," interrupted Lezhnyov, "we used once to say, 'Dmitri and Mikhail' to one another. Let us revive the old habit. Will you? Let us drink to the old days." Rudin started and drew himself up a little, and there was a gleam in his eyes of something no word can express. "Let us drink to them," he said. "I thank you, brother, we will drink to them." Lezhnyov and Rudin drained their glasses. "You know, Mikhail," Rudin began again with a smile and a stress on the name, "there is a worm in me which gnaws and worries me and never lets me be at peace till the end. It brings me into collision with people. At first they fall under my influence, but afterwards—" Rudin waved his hand in the air. "Since I parted from you, Mikhail, I have seen much, have experienced many changes. I have begun life, have started on something new 20 times, and here, you see—" "You had no stability," said Lezhnyov, as though to himself. "As you say, I had no stability. I never was able to construct anything. And it's a difficult thing, brother, to construct when one has to create the very ground under one's feet, to make one's own foundation for oneself. All my adventures, that is, speaking accurately, all my failures, I will not describe. I will tell of 2 or 3 incidents, those incidents of my life when it seemed as if success were smiling on me, or rather, when I began to hope for success, which is not altogether the same thing." Rudin pushed back his grey and already sparse locks with the same gesture which he used once to toss back his thick dark curls. "Well, I will tell you, Mikhail," he began. "In Moscow I came across a rather strange man. He was very wealthy, and was the owner of extensive estates. His chief and only passion was love of science, universal science. I have never yet been able to arrive at how this passion arose in him. It fitted him about as well as a saddle on a cow. He managed with difficulty to maintain himself at his mental elevation. He was almost without the power of speech. He only rolled his eyes with expression and shook his head significantly. I never met, brother, a poorer and less gifted nature than his. In the Smolensk province there are places like that, nothing but sand and a few tufts of grass which no animal can eat. Nothing succeeded in his hands, everything seemed to slip away from him. But he was still mad on making everything plain complicated. If it had depended on his arrangements, his people would have eaten standing on their heads. He worked and wrote and read indefatigably. He devoted himself to science with a kind of stubborn perseverance, a terrible patience. His vanity was immense, and he had a will of iron. He lived alone, and had the reputation of an eccentric. I made friends with him, and he liked me. I quickly, I must own, saw through him, but his zeal attracted me. Besides, he was the master of such resources. So much good might be done, so much real usefulness through him. I was installed in his house, and went with him to the country. My plans, brother, were on a vast scale. I dreamed of various reforms, innovations. "Just as at the Lasunsky's, do you remember, Dmitri?" responded Lezhnyov, with an indulgent smile. "Ah, but then I knew in my heart that nothing would come of my words but this time, an altogether different field of activity lay open before me. I took with me books on agriculture. To tell you the truth, I did not read one of them through. Well, I set to work. At first it did not progress as I had expected, but afterwards it did get on, in a way. My new friend looked on and said nothing. He did not interfere with me, at least not to any noticeable extent. He accepted my suggestions, and carried them out, but with a stubborn sullenness, a secret want of faith, and he bent everything his own way. He prized extremely every idea of his own. He got to it with difficulty, like a ladybird on a blade of grass, and he would sit and sit upon it, as though pluming his wings and getting ready for a flight, and suddenly he would fall off and begin crawling again. Don't be surprised at these comparisons. At that time they were always crowding on my imagination. So I struggled on there for 2 years. The work did not progress much in spite of all my efforts. I began to be tired of it, my friend bored me. I had come to sneer at him, and he stifled me like a feather-bed. His want of faith had changed into a dumb resentment. A feeling of hostility had laid hold of both of us. We could scarcely now speak of anything. He quietly but incessantly tried to show me that he was not under my influence. My arrangements were either set aside or altogether transformed. I realized, at last, that I was playing the part of a toady in the noble landowner's house by providing him with intellectual amusement. It was very bitter to me to have wasted my time and strength for nothing, most bitter to feel that I had again and again been deceived in my expectations. I knew very well what I was losing if I went away, but I could not control myself. And one day, after a painful and revolting scene of which I was a witness, and which showed my friend in a most disadvantageous light, I quarreled with him finally, went away, and threw up this newfangled pedant, made of a queer compound of our native flour kneaded up with German treacle. "That is, you threw up your daily bread, Dmitri," said Lezhnyov, laying both hands on Rudin's shoulders. "Yes, and again I was turned adrift, empty-handed and penniless, to fly whither I listed. Ah! Let us drink." "To your health," said Lezhnyov, getting up and kissing Rudin on the forehead. "To your health and to the memory of Pokorsky. He, too, knew how to be poor." "Well, that was number one of my adventures," began Rudin after a short pause. "Shall I go on?" "Go on, please." "Ah, I have no wish for talking. I am tired of talking, brother. However, so be it. After knocking about in various parts, by the way, I might tell you how I became the secretary of a benevolent dignitary, and what came of that. But that would take me too long. After knocking about in various parts, I resolved to become, at last, don't smile, please, a practical business man. The opportunity came in this way. I became friendly with, he was much talked of at one time, a man called Kurbyev. Oh, I never heard of him. But really, Dmitri, with your intelligence, how was it you did not suspect that to be a business man was not the business for you? I know, brother, that it was not. But then what is the business for me? But if you had seen Kurbyev! Do not, pray, fancy him as some empty-headed chatterer. They say I was eloquent once. I was simply nothing beside him. He was a man of wonderful learning and knowledge, an intellect, brother, a creative intellect, for business and commercial enterprises. His brain seemed seething with the boldest, the most unexpected schemes. I joined him, and we decided to turn our powers to a work of public utility. What was it, may I know? Rudin dropped his eyes. You will laugh at it, Mikhail. Why should I? No, I will not laugh. We resolved to make a river in the K province fit for navigation, said Rudin with an embarrassed smile. Really? This Kurbyev was a capitalist, then? He was poorer than I, responded Rudin, and his grey head sank on his breast. Lezhnyov began to laugh, but he stopped suddenly and took Rudin by the hand. "Pardon me, brother, I beg," he said, "but I did not expect that. Well, so I suppose your enterprise did not get further than paper?" "Not so. A beginning was made. We hired workmen and set to work. But then we were met by various obstacles. In the first place, the mill owners would not meet us favourably at all, and more than that, we could not turn the water out of its course without machinery, and we had not money enough for machinery. For 6 months we lived in mud huts. Kurbyev lived on dry bread, and I, too, had not much to eat. However, I don't complain of that. The scenery there is something magnificent. We struggled and struggled on, appealing to merchants, writing letters and circulars. It ended in my spending my last farthing on the project." "Well," observed Lezhnyov, "I imagine to spend your last farthing, Dmitri, was not a difficult matter?" "It was not difficult, certainly." Rudin looked out the window. "But the project really was not a bad one, and it might have been of immense service." "And where did Kurbyev go to?" asked Lezhnyov. "Oh, he is now in Siberia. He has become a gold digger. And you will see he will make himself a position. He will get on." "Perhaps. But then you will not be likely to make a position for yourself, it seems." "Well, that can't be helped. But I know I was always a frivolous creature in your eyes." "Hush, brother. There was a time, certainly, when I saw your weak side, but now, believe me, I have learnt to value you. You will not make yourself a position. And I love you, Dmitri, for that, indeed I do." Rudin smiled faintly. "Truly?" "I respect you for it," repeated Lezhnyov. "Do you understand me?" Both were silent for a little. "Well, shall I proceed to number 3?" asked Rudin. "Please do." "Very well. The third and last. I have only now got clear of number 3. But am I not boring you, Mikhail?" "Go on, go on." "Well," began Rudin, "once the idea occurred to me at some leisure moment. I always had plenty of leisure moments. The idea occurred to me: I have knowledge enough, my intentions are good. I suppose even you will not deny me good intentions?" "I should think not." "In all other directions I had failed more or less. Why should I not become an instructor, or, speaking simply, a teacher, rather than waste my life?" Rudin stopped and sighed. "Rather than waste my life, would it not be better to try to pass on to others what I know? Perhaps they may extract at least some use from my knowledge. My abilities are above the ordinary anyway. I am a master of language. So I resolved to devote myself to this new work. I had difficulty in obtaining a post. I did not want to give private lessons. There was nothing I could do in the lower schools. At last I succeeded in getting an appointment as professor in the gymnasium here." "As professor of what?" asked Lezhnyov. "Professor of literature. I can tell you I never started on any work with such zest as I did on this. The thought of producing an effect upon the young inspired me. I spent 3 weeks over the composition of my opening lecture." "Have you got it, Dmitri?" interrupted Lezhnyov. "No, I lost it somewhere. It went off fairly well, and was liked. I can see now the faces of my listeners, good young faces, with an expression of pure souled attention and sympathy, and even of amazement. I mounted the platform and read my lecture in a fever. I thought it would fill more than an hour, but I had finished it in 20 minutes. The inspector was sitting there, a dry old man in silver spectacles and a short wig. He sometimes turned his head in my direction. When I had finished, he jumped up from his seat and said to me, 'Good, but rather over their heads, obscure, too little said about the subject.' But the pupils followed me with appreciation in their looks. Indeed they did. Ah, that is how youth is so precious. I gave a second written lecture, and a third. After that I began to lecture extempore." "And you had success?" asked Lezhnyov. "I had great success. I gave my audiences all that was in my soul. Among them were 2 or 3 really remarkable boys. The rest did not understand me much. I must confess, though, that even those who did understand me sometimes embarrassed me by their questions. I did not lose heart. They all loved me. I gave them all full marks in examinations. But then an intrigue was started against me. Or, no, it was not an intrigue at all. It simply was that I was not in my proper place. I was a hindrance to the others, and they were a hindrance to me. I lectured to the gymnasium pupils in a way lectures are not given every day, even to students. They carried away very little from my lectures. I myself did not know the facts enough. Besides, I was not satisfied with the limited sphere assigned to me. You know that is always my weakness. I wanted radical reforms, and I swear to you that these reforms were both sensible and easy to carry out. I hoped to carry them through the director, a good and honest man, over whom I had at first some influence. His wife aided me. I have not, brother, met many women like her in my life. She was about 40, but she believed in goodness, and loved everything fine with the enthusiasm of a girl of 15, and was not afraid to give utterance to her convictions before any one whatever. I shall never forget her generous enthusiasm and goodness. By her advice I drew up a plan. But then my influence was undermined, I was misrepresented to her. My chief enemy was the professor of mathematics, a little sour, bilious man who believed in nothing, a character like Pigasov, but far more able than he was. By the way, how is Pigasov? Is he living?"
Oh, yes, and only fancy, he is married to a peasant woman, who, they say, beats him. Serve him right. And Natalya Alexyevna, is she well? Yes. Is she happy? Yes. Rudin was silent for a little. What was I talking about? Oh, yes, about the professor of mathematics. He perfectly hated me. He compared my lectures to fireworks, pounced upon every expression of mine that was not altogether clear, once even put me to confusion over some monument of the 16th century. But the most important thing was, he suspected my intentions. My last soap bubble struck on him as on a spike, and burst. The inspector, whom I had not got on with from the first, set the director against me. A scene followed. I was not ready to give in. I got hot. The matter came to the knowledge of the authorities. I was forced to resign. I did not stop there. I wanted to prove that they could not treat me like that, but they could treat me as they liked. Now I am forced to leave the town. A silence followed. Both the friends sat with bowed heads. Rudin was the first to speak. Yes, brother, he began, I can say now, in the words of Koltsov, thou hast led me astray, my youth, till there is nowhere I can turn my steps. And yet can it be that I was fit for nothing, that for me there was, as it were, no work on earth to do? I have often put myself this question, and however much I tried to humble myself in my own eyes, I could not but feel the existence of faculties within me which are not given to everyone. Why have these faculties remained fruitless? And let me say more. You know, when I was with you abroad, Mikhail, I was conceited and full of erroneous ideas. Certainly I did not then realize clearly what I wanted. I lived upon words, and believed in phantoms. But now, I swear to you, I could speak out before all men every desire I feel. I have absolutely nothing to hide. I am absolutely, in the fullest meaning of the word, a well-intentioned man. I am humble. I am ready to adapt myself to circumstances. I want little. I want to do the good that lies nearest, to be even a little use. But no, I never succeed. What does it mean? What hinders me from living and working like others? I am only dreaming of it now. But no sooner do I get into any definite position when fate throws the dice from me. I have come to dread it, my destiny. Why is it so? Explain this enigma to me. An enigma, repeated Lezhnyov. Yes, that's true. You have always been an enigma to me. Even in our young days, when, after some trifling prank, you would suddenly speak as though you were pierced to the heart, and then you would begin again, well, you know what I mean. Even then I did not understand. That is why I grew apart from you. You have so much power, such unwearying striving after the ideal. Words, all words. There was nothing done, Rudin broke in. Nothing done. What is there to do? What is there to do? To keep an old blind woman and all her family by one's work, as, do you remember, Mikhail Pryazentsov did. That's doing something. Yes, but a good word is also something done. Rudin looked at Lezhnyov without speaking, and faintly shook his head. Lezhnyov wanted to say something, and he passed his hand over his face. And so you are going to your country place? He asked at last. Yes. There you have some property left? Something is left me there. 2 souls and a half. It is a corner to die in. You are thinking perhaps at this moment, even now he cannot do without fine words. Words indeed have been my ruin. They have consumed me, and to the end I cannot be free of them. But what I have said was not mere words. These white hairs, brother, these wrinkles, these ragged elbows, they are not mere words. You have always been hard on me, Mikhail, and you were right. But now is not a time to be hard. When all is over, when there's no oil left in the lamp, and the lamp itself is broken, and the wick is just smouldering out. Death, brother, should reconcile at last. Lezhnyov jumped up. Rudin, he cried, why do you speak like that to me? How have I deserved it from you? Am I such a judge? And what kind of a man should I be if at the sight of your hollow cheeks and wrinkles, mere words could occur to my mind? Do you want to know what I think of you, Dmitri? Well, I think, here is a man, with his abilities, What might he not have attained to? What worldly advantages might he not have possessed by now if he had liked? And I meet him hungry and homeless." "I rouse your compassion," Rudin murmured in a choked voice. "No, you are wrong. You inspire respect in me. That is what I feel. Who prevented you from spending year after year at that landowner's? Who was your friend, and who would, I am fully persuaded, have made provision for you, if you had only been willing to humor him? Why could you not live harmoniously at the gymnasium? Why have you, strange man, with whatever ideas you have entered upon an undertaking, infallibly every time ended by sacrificing your personal interests, ever refusing to take root in any but good ground, however profitable it might be?" "I was born a rolling stone," Rudin said, with a weary smile. "I cannot stop myself." "That is true. But you cannot stop, not because there is a worm gnawing you, as you said to me at first. It is not a worm, not the spirit of idle restlessness. It is the fire of the love of truth that burns in you, and clearly, in spite of your failings, it burns in you more hotly than in many who do not consider themselves egoists and dare to call you a humbug, perhaps. I, for one, in your place, should long ago have succeeded in silencing that worm in me, and should have given in to everything. And you have not even been embittered by it, Dmitri. You are ready, I am sure, today, to set to some new work again, like a boy." "No, brother, I am tired now," said Rudin. "I have had enough." "Tired! Any other man would have been dead long ago. You say that death reconciles, but does not life, don't you think, reconcile? A man who has lived and has not grown tolerant towards others does not deserve to meet with tolerance himself. And who can say he does not need tolerance? You have done what you could, Dmitri. You have struggled so long as you could. What more? Our paths lay apart." "You were utterly different from me," Rudin put in with a sigh. "Our paths lay apart," continued Lezhnyov, "perhaps exactly because, thanks to my position, my cool blood, and other fortunate circumstances, nothing hindered me from being a stay-at-home, and remaining a spectator with folded hands. But you had to go out into the world, to turn up your shirt-sleeves, to toil and labour. Our paths lay apart, but see how near one another we are. We speak almost the same language, with half a hint we understand one another, we grew up on the same ideas. There is little left us now, brother. We are the last of the Mohicans. We might differ and even quarrel in old days, when so much life still remained before us. But now, when the ranks are thinned about us, when the younger generation is coming upon us with other aims than ours, we ought to keep close to one another. Let us clink our glasses, Dmitri, and sing as of old, Gaudeamus igitur. The friends clinked their glasses and sang the old student song in strained voices, all out of tune, in the true Russian style. "So you are going now to your country place," Lezhnyov began again. "I don't think you will stay there long, and I cannot imagine where and how you will end. But remember, whatever happens to you, you have always a place, a nest where you can hide yourself. That is my home. Do you hear, old fellow? Thought, too, has its veterans. They, too, ought to have their home." Rudin got up. "Thanks, brother," he said. "Thanks. I will not forget this in you. Only I do not deserve a home. I have wasted my life, and have not served thought as I ought." "Hush!" said Lezhnyov. "Every man remains what nature has made him, and one cannot ask more of him. You have called yourself the Wandering Jew. But how do you know? Perhaps it was right for you to be ever wandering. Perhaps in that way you are fulfilling a higher calling than you know. Popular wisdom says truly that we are all in God's hands. You are going, Dmitri," continued Lezhnyov, seeing that Rudin was taking his hat. "You will not stop the night?" "Yes, I am going. Good bye. Thanks. I shall come to a bad end." "God only knows. You are resolved to go?" "Yes, I am going. Good bye. Do not remember evil against me." "Well, do not remember evil against me either, and don't forget what I said to you. Good bye." The friends embraced one another. Rudin quickly went away. Lezhnyov walked up and down the room a long while, stopped before the window thinking, and murmured half aloud, Poor fellow. Then, sitting down to the table, he began to write a letter to his wife. But outside a wind had risen, and was howling with ill-omened moans, and wrathfully shaking the rattling window-panes. The long autumn night came on. Well for the man on such a night who sits under the shelter of home, who has a warm corner in safety, and the Lord help all homeless wanderers! On a sultry afternoon, on the 26th of July in 1848, in Paris, when the revolution of the Ateliers Nationaux had already been almost suppressed, a line battalion was taking a barricade in one of the narrow alleys of the Faubourg Saint Antoine. A few gunshots had already broken it. Its surviving defenders abandoned it, and were only thinking of their own safety, when suddenly, on the very top of the barricade, on the frame of an overturned omnibus, appeared a tall man in an old overcoat, with a red sash, and a straw hat on his grey, dishevelled hair. In one hand he held a red flag, in the other a blunt curved sabre, and as he scrambled up he shouted something in a shrill, strained voice, waving his flag and sabre. A 25 tirailleurs took aim at him, fired. The tall man dropped the flag, and like a sack he toppled over face downwards, as though he were falling at someone's feet. The bullet had passed through his heart. "Tiens," said one of the escaping revolutionists to another, "on vient de tuer les Polonais." "Bigre," answered the other, and both ran into the cellar of a house, the shutters of which were all closed, and its walls streaked with traces of powder and shot. This Polonais was Dmitry Rudin. End of Rudin, by Ivan Turgenev, translated by Constance Garnett. Recording by Lee Smalley.